Well, welcome to this webinar on the consequences of the election of Joe Biden at the White House for climate policy in the US and beyond in the international arena with the implementation of the Paris Agreement and in the European Union. I'm Richard Balme, professor at SciencesPo at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics, and the coordinator and convener of this seminar. This event is jointly organized by AIRE, SciencesPo Interdisciplinary Research Workshop on the Environment, the School of International Public Affairs and the EarthInstitute at Columbia University, and the Alliance program. And I'm glad to know that Emmanuel Caton is with us today. The Alliance program is a consortium of universities joining Columbia, SciencesPo, École Polytechnique, and Paris 1, Université Paris 1, and we're glad to have friends from all these universities with us today. In the general and worrying context of the COVID-19 pandemics, one of the very few good news of the last month has been the immediate and resolute return of the US within the Paris Agreement, a decision formally adopted on the first day of Biden's office and effective since February 19. A little more than 1 month ago. Together with the appointment of John Kerry as climate envoy for national security, this move shows the determination of this administration to address climate change and to regain the leadership position of the US in the climate international regime, simply abandoned by Donald Trump, as we all know. Will this open a new era for climate policy in the US and worldwide, given the polarization of the country, including on the climate issue, and the actual depression of multilateralism we are in? Much uncertainty remains on the capacity for climate policy to return to these enthusiastic moments of the COP21. While the European Union is currently designing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and with COVID-19 as the top priority for governments, it seems likely that, yes, indeed, the coming years will be a different area for climate policy. SciencesPo and Columbia University in New York have developed intensive relationships for many years, in particular through the Alliance program, and in particular around the issue of climate change. And the election of Joe Biden couldn't offer a better opportunity to arrange a joint event like this one. These issues will be discussed by 3 renowned and perfectly well-informed speakers. Jonathan Elkind, fellow and research scholar at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy at SIPA in Columbia. Jonathan has extensive experience in public and private engagement in energy policy. He worked noticeably as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. He worked with the Office of the Vice President of the United States on the Council on Environmental Quality. Scott Barrett is the Lenfest-Earth Institute Professor of Natural Resource Economics at Columbia University. He's also Vice Dean at SIPA. Scott published a number of important books on multilateralism and international regimes with Oxford University Press, and he's also very engaged in climate policy making, particularly with some experience with the International Panel on Climate Change. And finally, Brandon Devlin, with us today, is Strategy and Foresight Counsellor for the European Commission at the Directorate General for Energy. In addition to giving strategies advice, Brendan work focuses on methane emission reduction, short-lived climate pollutants, supply chain integrity, and transformation of national oil and gas companies. So Brendan is definitely an expert on energy, and the policy consultant, policy advisors with a very strong experience with the EU. So I would like to thank the three of you, our three panelists, for their presence with a busy agenda today, for sharing their thoughts and exchanging with us. Speakers will have around 20 minutes each. We will, if you agree, take questions through the Q&A rather than with the chat, which will be a little bit more difficult to handle given the number of the audience. And Bénédicte Barbet will take the questions and moderate the discussion. Let me thank Bénédicte before we start. Let me thank Bénédicte Barbet and the Direction Scientifique for their mobilization in arranging this event as well. So without further ado, let us start with Jonathan Elkind, if you agree. Jonathan, we all know that American politics is bitterly divided today. So our question to you would probably be, how effective can Joe Biden policy be? And given the division of the country, how lasting can this policy change be? Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you to all of the organizers. It is a pleasure to be with you, if only virtually. Being with you in Paris in the physical world is much better, I'll say, but this will have to be the alternative that is available to us under the current circumstances. To answer your question, Richard, I would say that with the start of the Biden administration, the United States enters a pretty complicated, pretty important time. In regard to climate, this is a moment of real accountability, I think, considerable opportunity, but also complexity that goes to the politics, as you just underscored yourself. Climate is one of the 4 historic crises that Joe Biden flagged throughout his campaign, his presidential campaign, and particularly in the summer of 2020 at the Democratic National Convention. The first and foremost being the pandemic, the second being the economic devastation resulting from the coronavirus, the third being centuries-long racial injustice in the United States, which must be attended to, the fourth being climate. So obviously, even just in that set of 4 so-called historic crises, one sees the work of several lifetimes. The question is whether one can advance progress in several at the same time. In the early weeks, still less than 100 days that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been in power, they have made clear that that dealing with the climate crisis is a task for the whole of the US government and the whole of our nation. They've instituted very ambitious top-line objectives, which in a very particular way make Biden and his presidency very visible, very accountable on the climate issue. The first among them is an economy-wide net zero target by 2050. The second, even more difficult, even more challenging, I would say, is the net zero objective for the electric power sector by 2035. And as we can discuss at greater length later, this is really truly a stretch goal given the existing statutory and regulatory bases in the United States, and in particular decision-making that is devolved to, well, that exists at the level of the 50 states across this country. These two signal goals will be pursued in part through the issuance in the coming weeks of a new nationally determined contribution, a target for the Paris Agreement. And I can talk more about that in a little bit as we go on. But I would stress that one of the most important procedural signals within the US government that embodies the priority that President Biden attaches to the climate issue is the fact that climate is now on everybody's to-do list across the US government. On January 20th, our inauguration day, and then 1 week later on January 27th, the president issued a series of major executive orders. These are tools that are used within our government, basically within the confines of existing statutory authority, to organize our government, to signal priorities of our government, to give tasks to the different cabinet and sub-cabinet agencies of our government. And in addition to referring to and highlighting the roles, the importance of our states, localities, and Native American tribes, and what their respective activities have been on climate, the January 27th executive order, for example, called for actions by 33 different US government agencies. Now, that only establishes the point that the tasking has been broad as to its level of ambition and its chances for success. Those merit independent analysis. So let's look at that. Basically, President Biden is calling for the use of basically all of the legal and regulatory levers that are at the disposal of the federal government. He has formed what many have referred to as a dream team of leaders in different federal agencies. Richard already referred to former Secretary of State John Kerry, who has been named as the Special Presidential Envoy on Climate. No less important is the fact that he also now serves as a member of our National Security Council, which is an unprecedented move. It is highly unusual to have any person who is not a member of the president's cabinet serve in the NSC, in the council itself. And the fact that Kerry is given this role signals very strongly that in the internal wiring of the US government, he will have the ability to exert influence very strongly. No less significant is the domestically focused team led by Gina McCarthy. Gina McCarthy, under the Obama administration, was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. She is a wonderful force of nature, an extremely experienced environmental strategist and advocate. She has formed a team inside the White House, the National Climate Advisor Office, that is coordinating the actions that are taken elsewhere across the US government. The tools of our financial sector are also being brought to bear. The new Treasury Secretary, Dr. Janet Yellen, indicated from the very beginning that she intends to have climate-related risks and opportunities be a core element of what the Treasury Department will do. She will have a senior climate advisor. She will also help to coordinate, and she does this as a former chair of the Federal Reserve. She will help to coordinate the actions of the other financial institutions, the Fed itself, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the US participation in multilateral development banks. All of these tools are within the reach of the Treasury Secretary and will be an area for focus. Already at the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, even in advance of the confirmation of the intended next chair, the SEC is reviewing compliance with guidance on climate exposure that was issued under the Obama administration in 2010. To look to the Fed, the chairman of the Federal Reserve has called for the establishment of two very important areas of focus, one being systemic risks to the US financial system, and the other being the vulnerabilities of individual financial institutions, individual banks. Very clearly, this signals the recognition, and interestingly, this comes from a Fed chairman appointed not by the current president, Joe Biden, but by Donald Trump. This signals an awareness that if not duly considered as an evolving risk, climate impacts could pose very deep risks both to individual banks and to the financial system as a whole. More about the tools that will be used. Executive action. I've already referred to a couple of the executive orders that were promulgated early on. In less than 1 month's time, on April 22nd, Earth Day, the president will convene 40 different heads of state and government for a so-called Leaders Summit on Climate. This is the event in advance of which the new US nationally determined contribution will be issued. That event is meant to, if you will pardon the expression, serve as a coming out party of sorts for the return of the United States to climate. Regulations will be another tool that will be used. Already, the Biden administration has signaled its intention to reverse Donald Trump's, in my opinion, irresponsible deregulatory action in regard to methane. This is a little bit of a complicated story we can get into in Q&A if this is of interest, but simply rolling back and reinstating the Obama regulations is not a perfect solution because of some of the shortcomings of those regulations as they existed. Nonetheless, we are undoubtedly better off to have regulation of methane emissions than to have the deregulatory impulse governing, as was the case with Mr. Trump. Another action that has been taken at the executive level on the basis of existing statutory authority is an interim reimposition of the social cost of carbon. Social cost of carbon, for those not familiar, is a calculation that was developed first by the Obama administration, a translation into present value of the impacts of a changing climate. Lest one operate under the misguided belief that emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is a cost-free undertaking. This was a calculation full of imperfections, but a calculation that attempted to put some bounds on the costs that arise from those emissions. A thorough reassessment of the social cost of carbon is now being undertaken, but an interim measure is being used for such actions as calculation of benefits and costs for regulatory development and so forth. There's a slew of existing statutes that are also now able to be applied by an administration that cares about climate. For example, at the end of 2020, after long and hard work of a rare sort in the American political context at present, namely bipartisan work. A piece of legislation called the Energy Act of 2020 was passed, and it has a whole range of different provisions that call for pilot programs and commercialization efforts on everything from small modular reactors to green and blue hydrogen development and carbon capture and large-scale utilization and solar power and offshore wind and a million other elements. The US tax code, which importantly had instituted a price on carbon through what is referred to as the 45Q measure. Some of those statutory provisions will be especially important to incent new investments in the next several years in CO2 capture and sequestration and utilization systems. New statutory tools are being explored as well. Later this week, on Wednesday, the 31st, we expect that President Biden will announce the outlines of his priorities for a major infrastructure bill, which will be introduced into the US Congress. Now, there's no certainty as to the form of an ultimate bill. We will see that in the fullness of time. But some of the ideas, elements that are being discussed for the first of these infrastructure bills includes things like reconstruction of road, port, and rail systems, especially to emphasize climate resilience, investments in bridges and tunnels, flood protection, public transport systems, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, funding for the capping and closing of leaking oil and gas wells and disused mines. So many different elements of infrastructure will be addressed, and many of them that are candidates have the potential to be relevant to climate. I will resist the risk to put the entire audience to sleep by continuing with an enumeration of each and every element of the Biden climate plan, and I'm happy to get into more of the elements in our discussion. I will say, though, just as a listing of some things that might merit further attention, that there are a number of really challenging topics where the precise balancing of interests in regard to Biden policies remains to be seen. And here I think about challenges around the development of a hydrogen economy. The United States is very much more at the early stage than is the case even in Europe, where there are a few investments that are highly developed, but where strategy development is much farther along than we are. There are challenges, big challenges, around interacting with China on climate. China must be a part of the solution set on climate, simply because of the scale of their emissions as the world's leading emitters of greenhouse gases. China needs climate solutions very plainly, but we are in a time of very complicated interactions with China. So what does that look like? How does that get animated? What is the future of natural gas? For many years, the standard, rather insufficient shorthand that was used was that natural gas would be a bridge fuel to a decarbonizing energy future. And that always imperfect image may definitively have outlasted its usefulness, but one shouldn't be simple-minded about this. A transition from how the use of natural gas, the particular ways in which we use natural gas today, to what might be in the future, whether that is renewable gases, so to speak, biogases, or other applications, that all remains to be seen. And the difference between how we think about natural gas in OECD countries and how one thinks about natural gas in some other marketplaces, for example, emerging economies, these are important questions that need to be thought through. And a last one, trade. On the one hand, we absolutely must have international trade in order to see the development, the commercialization, and the broad deployment of clean energy technologies around the globe. But we are living in a time where there is a great deal of skepticism about free trade as it has been practiced for the last several decades. So how does one develop policies that take account of the need for job protection in order to have the political economic support for climate solutions without so changing the setting for trade that one does not see the movement of technologies in the way that one needs to. I will stop just by saying that the remarks that I've made come within a context where we all ought to understand that time is short, that we need action at scale. In the United States, this will face headwinds from our politics. So we need also not just ideas that can be implemented in the lifetime of the Biden administration, but ones that prove themselves to be durable because they develop and they secure political support that enables continuity and predictability. The United States has re-entered the climate arena after what is our, let's remember, our second walk away. I say this with no joy and certainly no pride. We have a huge opportunity in that we, in the United States, now have an administration that is completely all in on dealing with the climate crisis. We are better off to have the opportunity to re-engage with partners in Europe and elsewhere, but this will not be a simple track moving forward. With that, I'll stop. Thank you, Lichao.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this very precise and stimulating presentation. We understand that the Biden, probably no U.S. administration has been as well equipped to address climate and modern environment than this one. And it's a difficult balance between setting more ambitious goals and at the same time designing more effective tools or instruments which can be better accepted socially and politically. But okay, so I think we will come back in the discussion. We already have several questions for you, but we will return to this in the discussion. Let us turn to Scott Barrett, if you agree, Scott. So the big news for the climate regime and the climate negotiations is the return of the US in the Paris Agreement. Of course, this is fantastic in a way. It's a historical moment even if we look at this from a history of multilateralism. It's a big event. Will that be enough? Will this be sufficient? And how far will this be effective and improve the climate regime?
Richard, thank you so much. Great question. It's actually one I wanted to address. And let me thank you for this invitation and for coming up with the idea of organizing this. Bernard, great to see you again. Emmanuel, thank you as always. And Benedict, thank you so much. Jonathan gave a great summary of the status of the US right now, which is poised for something. And then the question is really what, I think what I want to do is give a little context for this. And I'm always interested in the global picture because, as I'm sure everyone in this webinar knows, it's only global emissions that matter, not US emissions or EU emissions. It's all emissions. And I think in terms of context, one thing to say, kind of a direct answer to your question, Richard, is that I think US activity, I'm a little hesitant to use the word leadership because of all the changes that we've seen over the last few decades. But I think US active engagement, including leadership, is necessary. And I don't think it's sufficient because this is a colossal global problem. And we need only consider China and how important China is in terms of global emissions, which really wasn't true in 1990 when the negotiations began. In a way, we've let through these decades-long negotiations, we've let a kind of solution, as it were, slip through our hands, and I think that was a major mistake. But what it really means is that the U.S. power in this context is diminished from what it used to be. And this is truly an issue that requires broad-scale multilateral efforts. Jonathan mentioned the Climate Leaders Summit that President Biden is convening for April 22 and April 23. That I assume will be preceded by Biden announcing the NDC, the nationally determined contribution by the US. There'll be a lot of pressure for him to state very ambitious targets. We hear those words all the time. By the way, ambitious targets, we've been hearing about this for 30 years. And as someone who's been involved all this time, it seems pretty easy to announce targets. It's harder to actually bring about real change. And I think Jonathan was pointing to, he used the word complexity. And I think that, boy, everything he described just shows you just how difficult it is just from the US side. But what the US is ultimately going to be able to do is also going to depend an awful lot on what the US can expect other countries to do. The US is not going to act except in lockstep with other countries. So there's this kind of this tension. On the one hand, we're looking for leadership. On the other hand, I think it's going to be hard to get that, and I'll explain why, unless the US has some assurance that other countries are going to go march in the same direction. And so I said the US leadership is necessary but not sufficient. There are these broader forces that have been at work and are at work on this issue. And so when we see the US, and I think the US behavior on climate can be described very simply as erratic and unreliable over 30 years. And it's easy, I guess, to look at that and say, well, the problem we've had globally is that the US has not been a reliable partner. But I think there's another way to look at it, and there's some truth in that. But there's another way to look at this, I think, which is that the US behavior is a little bit of a symptom of a problem which is without precedent in all of human history: how to transform the economic and infrastructure, economic system and system of infrastructure worldwide when markets don't want to do it. I mean, that's unprecedented. So I think to some extent what we're seeing is the US behavior reflecting the symptom of the problem and not necessarily being entirely just a cause of the problems that we've had. One other thing just to mention, just bear in mind that as this issue has slipped through our hands, concentrations are rising every year. The concerns about climate change are mounting. There will be pressure for countries all over the world, including the United States, to do more and more on their own. But none of that is going to add up to what is needed for us to do what's required collectively. And it's that gap that we really need to focus on. So what is going on in individual countries, less important. Whether countries are doing more in some sense, less important. Much more important that we're actually moving towards a true transformation. And you don't bring about a transformation just by announcing a goal. You have to have a strategy for getting there. That's another thing I want to talk about. I want to link that at the end with this discussion of trade that has come up. Let me just give a little history, which I think is valuable. So we started with the international negotiations started, well, late 1980s, but officially with UN endorsement in 1990. This led to the Framework Convention on Climate Change being adopted in 1992. And I think people probably won't remember, I was pretty involved in those days. And there was an effort to negotiate an agreement with so-called binding emission limits for the richer countries, leading up to Rio in 1992. And Europe was leading on this, as it has been all along. But George H.W. Bush, who was president at that time, was not going to allow the United States to be bound in that way. And that language that you read in the Framework Convention about making efforts and so on, I don't have it in front of me, but it's a very kind of a relaxed language, very non-specific. That a lot of that was coming from the Bush administration. So the US there is definitely not leading. And now this agreement is a foundational agreement for everything we've been doing globally on climate. And it has the world's full participation. Even Trump didn't contemplate withdrawing from the Framework Convention, at least to my knowledge. And yet the reason it has full participation is that it doesn't require that any country do anything in particular apart from some reporting. So that's a way to get full cooperation. You simply don't ask countries to do anything much specific. Now, Kyoto was building on the Framework Convention and now ask countries to do the things that they wouldn't do before and to agree on national emission limits. This was negotiated in the Clinton administration. Al Gore went to Kyoto in the final days to cement the agreement. And the problem with that at that moment was that we already knew that the US was unlikely to ratify that agreement. The United States Senate, so under the US Constitution, treaties have to be, well, the US Constitution requires the advice that the administration that negotiates the treaty seek the advice and consent of the Senate. And the Senate basically adopted a resolution which told the administration, you didn't seek our advice and we're not going to give you our consent. And that was in the summer preceding Kyoto, which was held in December of 1997. Now, this Senate resolution, I still think that the concerns expressed there, I think they still exist. Maybe slightly different forms, but they still exist. There were two concerns. One is that the Senate was not going to ratify a treaty that asked the rich countries, basically, including the United States, to act without the poorer countries, and there was definitely an eye on China, acting as well, which was not part of the Kyoto Protocol. And the other thing was that the Senate was not going to support a treaty that would be costly to the US economy. And I think that remains, Jonathan mentioned the different priorities, 4 different priorities of the administration, and that's one of them. Interestingly, I checked this this morning. I know that the vote on the Senate resolution was 95-0. So you think, the Senate can never agree on anything. Well, it did. It agreed it wouldn't approve of Kyoto in 1997. 95-0. 2 of those senators who voted yay for this resolution, one was Joe Biden and another was John Kerry. So they cared about climate change. That wasn't really in dispute. It was having a deal on climate that would be justified in economic terms, not damage the economy, just a slightly different thing, and be part of a global effort so that the US could be sure that it wasn't losing competitiveness. This is going to connect with the trade issue we're going to come to. And also that, that the actions of each country making a sacrifice add up to something that's actually going to achieve the objective, which is to limit climate change. Like, that has to be demonstrated. And I think that problem remains. And this meeting that Jonathan mentioned that the president will be convening in April, I think that's one thing he needs to get from that meeting, is that the US is moving in lockstep with other countries, because those concerns are going to, reemerge in the Senate, even just on the Democrat side. So I think that problem, which has always been there, remains. Now, after Kyoto, we had Copenhagen. That was a very difficult situation. And leading up to Copenhagen, the United States was trying to pass legislation, which is generally known as the Waxman-Markey bill, which is actually a really ambitious bill to limit emissions 83% from the 2005 level. By the way, the US had switched the base year from 1990, as it was negotiated under Kyoto, to 2005. It'll probably be very shocking for everyone to understand that US emissions were a lot higher in 2005 to 1990. So when the US is reducing from 2005, it's not as good as if they were reducing from 1990. Europe is still with 1990. 1990 works for Europe, it doesn't work for the US. And to some extent, you're already seeing here the difficulties in these targets in terms of establishing comparability among different players. And Copenhagen was a failure in many respects. Obama actually played a leadership role in Copenhagen by turning the attention away from these so-called binding targets and more towards asking countries what they were willing to do on their own to contribute to meeting the global target. And that set us on a path for Paris. So basically you had a total switch. Kyoto, there was this thing called a Doha Amendment that was negotiated, but that's a kind of a cul-de-sac because everyone knows this is all overtaken now by Paris, and Paris, basically the basis of Paris is really established in the spur of the moment in Copenhagen with Obama leadership. Now, of course, Obama submitted the NDC for the United States, which was to bring about something in the neighborhood of a 25% reduction in US emissions from the 2005 level by 2025. You might ask, how are we doing? Well, we're actually pretty close to 25% now, thanks partly to COVID, which is not a very good climate policy, I have to say. But emissions are expected to rise in the future. As Jonathan mentioned, the executive orders that Obama had adopted to achieve those targets, they were obviously rescinded by, taken back by Trump. U.S. emissions didn't rise under Trump, though, which is interesting too, and it's because these trends, for example, natural gas replacing coal, trends in emissions per unit of energy use per unit of GDP, which is a global trend. Those things have helped to limit emissions, but not to bring about the kind of changes people are asking for, including a 50% cut in emissions by 2030, 9 years. We have 250 years of growth in emissions worldwide, 250 years. And the idea that we're going to cut global emissions 50% in 9 years, it's just not realistic. What we actually need to do is transform investment worldwide, and that requires a fundamental change in incentives. And I don't think that the targets themselves are sufficient to achieve that. One has to believe that the fundamental economics underpinning investment is changing worldwide. That's something quite different. Now, where do we go on the international picture? One thing that Jonathan didn't mention, I know he knows about it, but one thing I think is promising, we have an agreement negotiated October 2016 in Kigali, which John Kerry was involved in, and that agreement, amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which limits the production and consumption of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which are a greenhouse gas that Kyoto meant to limit. But that's being done now under the Montreal Protocol, which is a very successful agreement. I think there's a very good chance that the Senate will ratify. I think Biden can get the Senate to ratify this. This has industry support, and we already know that the number of Republican senators have supported this. So this gets to a fundamental point, which is when you go to any constituency, you have to ask them to do something that they're going to say yes to, and not that they're going to say no to. And I think that's part of the attraction of Kigali. Now, another thing about Kigali, it's embedded in a system that's fundamentally different from the approach we've taken to address climate change in other respects. Yes, there are some targets and timetables in Kigali, but more importantly, the Kigali is embedded in the system in which you have a restriction on trade between the countries that are in the agreement and the countries that are outside. And what that does, once you achieve a critical mass of support for the treaty, the gains from trade are going to draw countries into the treaty instead of staying outside and free riding. And that's the kind of success that we need to replicate in other climate agreements. We haven't had that up to this point. You also can address these fundamental issues, global issues around equity through side payments, as we have through the Montreal Protocol. So I think the most positive diplomatic success on climate so far is actually this one. Now, it's addressing a small part of the problem, obviously, but it really opens the door to whether we can negotiate agreements that are more like this. They're smaller, they're less political, they involve technical issues, they involve communicating with industries and getting their support, and they involve trade measures. But the trade measures are not meant to be used. If they're really successful, as they have been in the Montreal Protocol, it's the credible threat of using them that suffices to get the countries to participate. Or to think about it differently, with those measures, I have a greater assurance that others are going to play their part to meet a collective goal, because if they don't, they'll get hit by trade measures. So therefore, because I have more confidence that they will do their part, I'll do my part. And that's the kind of approach we've been missing elsewhere in terms of climate. So I see this approach, if it were pursued by the administration, as being ultimately will be more successful. Let me just mention briefly the other approach that's been mentioned about border tax adjustments. I look forward to hearing from Brendan Devlin about this. The interest in border tax adjustments is going to grow as you get countries doing more, but especially as they're doing more when they're not in lockstep, right? That's why the lockstep is so important. The issues of competitiveness connecting with the issues of actually achieving emission reduction worldwide. But the border tax adjustments are a complicated and provocative move. We've seen it before when Europe wanted to bring in international aviation into the emissions trading system, essentially. The US, by the way, took the same move in the Waxman-Markey bill I mentioned before, where the trade-sensitive sectors were going to be treated separately from other parts of the economy, with more or less a very similar kind of approach as Europe was trying to take on international aviation. Now, as you probably know, when Europe went to take that move, which, by the way, I thought made a lot of sense, because the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is supposed to be negotiating limits for aviation, failed. So I think what Europe was proposing, was provocative, but it was also a good move in the sense of getting countries to take seriously what they said they were going to try to do. However, as soon as Europe announced this, a lot of major countries, the United States, China, Russia, India, announced retaliatory measures. Now, in the end, what happened? Europe scaled back, at least temporarily. ICAO is supposed to be, is launching a program, which I don't have a huge amount of confidence in because it involves a lot of offsets and so on. I think it's not clear where that's going to go. But what I would suggest is that rather than pursue border tax adjustments, which in a way is moving away from the whole idea of negotiation, it's basically saying what we're doing is the right thing to do. If you don't do what we're doing, we're going to impose these border measures. A very different approach in the Kigali-like approach is to use the measures, which are designed actually quite differently, just to encourage participation. Now, once you get countries to participate, then the problems of leakage, competitiveness, all that go away. I think that's what our focus should be. It should be on using measures like this to bring about participation in agreement where they're agreed, they're not just imposed unilaterally. So that's a different approach. I think it addresses some of the concerns in Europe. I think ultimately it would be more successful. I think a generalized approach for border tax adjustments is going to create problems for the trading system. And Jonathan mentioned, the difficulties that people have with the trading system, and I understand all of that. At the same time, a lot of our prosperity and even world peace have been connected with interconnectedness and a rules-based system of deciding on how trade should be conducted. So I think that's an area that requires caution. And I think what will ultimately be a lot more successful is an approach that uses trade to promote cooperation. Thanks so much, Richard.
Very interesting to think of all these different issues you mentioned. I'm particularly interested in your suggestion about sort of what I would call the good approach to climate negotiations, to have maybe smaller agreements, but more where inclusion and exclusion can create an incentive to participate. We see where this comes from in your training and your approach, and also to evoke the history of this of the U.S. position on climate, which was every time very central in climate agreements, and at the same time with a lot of tension between the executive and the Congress, and the U.S. administration being in a way torn apart between taking international commitments and having them improved at the domestic level. So in a way, the U.S. Congress appears as the most powerful veto group in the climate regime, internationally speaking, and we will see if the Biden administration managed to pilot and to manage the politics of this relationship, which is so difficult with more skills than what has been the case in the past. So thank you for your comments, Scott. Let me turn to Brandon. We're all very eager to see and to listen to his reactions. We have many European students or scholars in the audience, and we are all very eager to understand what is this exactly changing for European policy regarding climate and European position in climate negotiations. So, Brandon, the floor is yours. Please tell us if you see, viewed from Brussels, is that good news, a very good news, or relatively good news? We can't expect it to be bad news, but how do you see the situation viewed from the European Commission?
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to Jonathan and to Scott. To address your immediate question, is it good news or great news or very good news? We must remember we are Europeans, so it's understatement that we go for. So it's okay. It's okay. We're okay with the changes that we are seeing in the United States, and I'm sure we can adapt to it. That's definitely the case. I wanted to structure my remarks by saying two parts. One, I have to do the things I am told to say, which is the first part, which is address our priorities for the EU-US relationship. And then secondly, to respond to what Jonathan and to what Scott have said. And I just want to also say, I'm so happy to speak here and to hear people talking positively about game theory and credible threats and such like. It takes me back to the London School of Economics and learning about game theory. And to all the students out there, I just want to say that it's one of the most useful things to learn about that you can possibly pick up at university. And on an everyday basis, we use it in the European Commission for our negotiation strategies. And I'll say a bit more about negotiation strategies at the end of this intervention. But it is so welcome to hear the use of theory and the application of theory to real life problems, and to do that in an academic environment, and to support that, because for so many, what is done at universities in this area has no apparent practical application. But it's not the case. We use these things every day in negotiations. To turn to the first point, which is what are our priorities? I think we have three priorities for the period up until COP26 with the United States. And the first of those is to get a broad agreement on the reduction of methane emissions in the global atmosphere. If we could bring down all anthropogenic methane emissions to the technical minimum without changing lifestyles, that means eating less beef or flying less or doing all of the things that we do normally. If we could bring down the methane emissions to the technical limit by 2030, we could cut off about 0.18 to 0.3 degrees centigrade by 2050. That may not seem a lot if I say it like that, but it is 1/3 of everything we need to do in order to hit our 1.5 degree centigrade pathway until 2050. The methane file has been, as Jonathan mentioned, not entirely supported by our friends in the United States in the past 4 or 5 years. It needs to be underpinned with international efforts and international agreement. If we can get that international agreement, then the things that we need to do are very, very positive for our economies. If we are able to reduce the methane emissions by 50 to 80% in the oil and gas sector, they are cost positive methane emissions. They will make us money. And if we then go on to the remaining 20% or so, we are talking about financing people to close mines or cap wells or do things practically out in the real world. And that puts money into the economy and into the real wages of the communities who are affected by the changes that we will see in the next 10 to 20 years. So methane is very much something that we want to find a quick agreement with the United States and with Canada, and also with Japan, China, and Korea. And I'll say a few words about why we are choosing those countries. Those are the countries that are importing natural gas and oil, and indeed coal. And we need those importing countries to say that they want to have better standards from the exporters. And if we can promote this type of work internationally, we can also promote change amongst the exporters. And to go to Scott's discussion of game theory, we have a small group that we have to coordinate against a large group that is desperately uncoordinated, even in one sector, such as oil. So we need to think about how we can use consumer power as opposed to producer power to bring about change in global supply chains. And that's how we are approaching the methane question, and we hope for US support on that. A second point is that we need to work with the United States, Canada, and others on sector integration, about using the assets that we have already much better. We need to have a greater degree of electrification of final energy use. We need to develop hydrogen. We need to think of all of the things that have been on the books for the last 10 years, but which have not been implemented. One of the criticisms of the, or should I say I shouldn't ever say criticisms. One of the interesting analyses of the Obama administration is that they had an all-of-the-above approach to solutions and fuels. We need to take all of those solutions and start to implement them, particularly in the electricity supply sector, for heating, for cooling, for building better houses with better integration of the support systems from energy that are necessary in those sectors. And so we need to think about, how do you create heat from heat pumps, for example? How do you get people to put those things of their own volition, rather than being forced to put them in through mandatory means or other measures? And that is something that the European Union itself is addressing right now. But we can learn from others, and indeed others can learn from us. There must be a better way to look at the energy system integration that is necessary to bring down global energy use in the residential sector, in the heating sector, and elsewhere. We had a moment of epiphany many years ago in the European Union when there was a blackout in Switzerland, which affected Italy and France, as far as I remember, a huge blackout, which made the member states work together to find solutions to help with the interconnectedness of the European grid, to mitigate the problems of renewables across large areas, and to generally integrate the systems. Perhaps Texas is the United States epiphany this time round. Perhaps we can see the value of having integrated asset systems across many states in the United States, and we can see it in the European Union, and we have been working towards that in the European Union for several years, and we'd be very happy to share that advice and information with the United States. And we're very interested to hear about the experiences of California and New York and others who have had similar policies to ours and have implemented them. The third area where we could work together is on the clean tech alliance type issues. There, we need to find ways of propagating the clean technologies that we have developed, turning them not only into a trade opportunity, but into a development and influence opportunity. We have seen the attempt by China, others, to use investment as a method for political gain. We need to think not in such brutal terms, but we need to think, how is it that we can influence third countries to go forward into the new era of no hydrocarbons in their energy networks, but also to think about how it is that the European Union, the United States, the established democracies can be their friends and partners in developing a more just economy. And the Clean Tech Alliance and other efforts in that area are key to the general appreciation of the European Union and North America in the global arena. And it is a vector by which we can influence many countries around the world. When we go to African countries, for example, or South American countries, we do not want to have a negative message, which is that you must keep your hydrocarbons in the ground. We need to find a positive message, which is that those countries can develop and can develop cleanly and with the appreciation of many, if they take the opportunities that they have today and implement them. And we need to help them to make the right choices. That is why we are putting an emphasis on, in the OECD, for example, on creating opportunities for national oil companies to transform themselves into national energy companies. We do not want to be blinded by a potential view that the only way forward is through private enterprise and other issues. We must see that the overriding issue is the climate issue. And if the preferred choice of many countries is to work through a national oil company or a national energy company, we must help them. But we must find a way of delivering our expertise, our trade services, our systems in a green alliance for those developing countries that need it. Now I come to the second part of what I'd like to say, which is about what I've heard from my colleagues across the pond. And I'd like to say that everything I've heard is extremely encouraging. One of the overriding aspects of our work in the European Union is not just about ecological sustainability, but it is also about political sustainability. If we cannot find political sustainability for our work, we will not find ecological sustainability. And that is the message that many took away from the protests such as the Gilets jaunes in France, but others across the European Union have known and acknowledged this issue. There is a way forward here, and that is to think of new ways of engagement with our partners. And Jonathan and Scott mentioned how important it is for the United States to be seen working in lockstep with other partners. That's certainly a consideration for the European Union, but it's also something that we need to bear in mind. It's not an end in itself. It is if it has a strategic value. And one of the things that we have, which may have changed while the United States has been away from the international climate table, is that we are changing our way of approach. Our theory of change in the international climate negotiations is changing. Something like the credible threat idea and the game theoretical perspectives developed by Scott. We want to bring around real change, and the question is how to do it. Who can we organize, and who do we organize them against, and why do we do it? And those are questions of strategy. We're also looking at new ways of doing things. For example, when you look at the United States, is it always the right way to go with the United States to think of a treaty? Can we think of political agreements? Can we think of a political agreement, for example, for the United States to institute measurement, reporting, and verification of methane emissions in the United States, and for the European Union to agree politically that we will do it in the European Union, but there to be no treaty obligation between us? That is an opportunity that we could develop and was used previously in areas like the blood diamonds process, the Kimberley process. It is a way of creating a private garden, as it were, for commitments between sovereign countries, and they make an obligation to each other to trade only within that community. The Kimberley process, you accept that country X has implemented the obligations and you can trade freely with that country. This encourages other countries to come into the process. For example, in methane, we have looked to ways of encouraging participation rather than obligation. And participation can come as the first step towards obligation, as opposed to putting the obligation up front as a difficult first step. There we are using a process where we're saying, if you participate, you can continue to freely enter the market. However, we are not saying that the obligation must be that you must have a 0.2 methane emissions intensity target across your portfolio. We are saying, come into the system. If you have difficulties, or you've had difficulties in the past on methane emissions, we will forget about that, but come into the system, and then we will develop a process of obligation with you for the future. And so we are very much focused now on participation rather than obligation. And this also implies a change to the way we approach trade. And you've mentioned that, for example, in the case of the carbon border adjustment. Here we are looking not at trade as a restriction on trade. What we are thinking about is our obligations in the trading community. And the real paradigm shift here is not to think of polluters as being responsible for the emissions in the global atmosphere, but to think of consumers as the ones who have the obligation. And if we look at it, if we look at the world like that, the differences that this can create in our political obligations is quite important. What is it that a European country has extremely low emissions, but imports crude oil from a country with high emissions and refines it? This is not the way that we are going to close the gap globally on what our emissions should be. We need to find ways of persuading the producer to change her behavior in the future, and we can use our purchasing power to do that. And that is why it's important that we think about talking to countries like China, to Korea, to Japan and others, maintaining the free, open and transparent international trading system, but creating obligations along the supply chains which drive change in the countries from which we have traditionally purchased hydrocarbons, and also thinking about the end game when we have dwindling demand and over supply. How are we going to choose between those who continue to supply, between the best and the worst? I would suggest right now that in any rational, sane world, we will be choosing those who have shown the best behavior over the longest time, rather than those who continue to pollute in the short term in order to have low costs in the long term. Those are the ideas that we are developing in the European Union. I'd be very interested to take as many questions as you could potentially generate through all of the opportunities that you have between Paris and New York. And I would love to continue this conversation in many more seminars beyond today. Back to you.
I was thinking, listening to you during this presentation, that when you mentioned Texas and California, that it would be interesting to draw parallels for comparativists like me about the impact of federalism or quasi-federalism in the food system, and how does that impact on climate policy at the top, I would say. Thank you. I think we have many questions and for you, for the three of you. So I'm tempted to give the floor immediately to Benedict and to the audience through the moderation of Benedict. Benedict?
Okay, so many questions to the three of us. To make it more lively, I will open the microphone to the audience who will ask questions. And I asked people to give you 2 words about you, who you are and where are you coming from, and then ask questions a bit short, if you may, because we have so many one. So a first one from Tim Borsma. Sorry if it's not the good pronunciation. So he's got questions for both Jonathan and Brendan. So Tim, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank
Okay.
you. And I appreciate your pronunciation. That was close enough. So thank you for that too.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists for the great conversation. I hope you can hear me well. I assume that is the case. A question for Jonathan. After his great overview, in previous administrations, the State Department had a role of special envoy at the Bureau of Energy, who did many things, but among them promoting consumption of oil and natural gas, in particular natural gas, I guess, abroad. And I wonder if you suspect that the current administration will fill that role, or whether that has sort of migrated into a more climate-focused role that, you know, Special Envoy Kerry has taken on. The second question for Brendan has been touched on, I guess, in part, but I wonder, we've seen the major policy swing in the United States. Of course, at the EU member state level, there is a substantial amount of skepticism about climate policy as well. Yet European agreement sort of stands on where the ambition level should lie, and it's been ramped up in recent years. Do you think that the EU as such is better harnessed against policy swings like we've seen in the US, or would that be a premature conclusion? Thank you.
I guess I'll kick off. Tim, thank you for your question. So I do expect that the Biden team will appoint an assistant secretary to head the Bureau of Energy Resources at the State Department. You are right that the landscape there has shifted with the arrival of former Secretary Kerry in the role of Special Presidential Envoy on Climate. There are a number of issues that relate to diplomacy around energy that are not climate per se. And so some of those roles will continue to be handled by the State Department, I expect. I could give an example of issues around sanctions, energy-related sanctions, just as one. Will that Bureau engage in the promotion of natural gas consumption or other activities? I don't know for sure. My guess is that the answer will be no. Now, I think we can all recognize the fact that there are cases in which certain emerging economies are very interested in increasing their natural gas consumption for purposes of having dispatchable power and reducing local air quality problems. This will be a tricky balancing act for the Biden administration to figure out its position on. I think there's a pretty compelling argument that says that, as a noted scholar from Center on Global Development recently said, you shouldn't penalize Kenya because greenhouse gas emissions in the OECD countries were high for so long. But there is also the question of how one makes it appealing, how one makes it affordable from a upfront capital perspective, how one makes it demystified, de-risked as a technical issue to go directly to zero carbon solutions. And that will be the creative space where I think the Biden administration will be focusing a great deal.
Thank Tim for his question. Do I think European Union energy and climate policy is stable over the long term? I definitely think it is. Indeed, sometimes it gets too stable rather than the opposite. The interesting point about European federalism is that it creates consensus and it prevents, over the long term, destabilization of that consensus, even in highly contested areas, such as climate and energy policy, but also other areas, migration and such like. There is always dissonance, always argument, and the argument continues after the issue has been closed, but the general themes and the major elements of policy continue. I do think that we have a strong stability in the European Union, potentially a stability which works against us at times, both politically and internationally. But I don't think there's any doubt that we are in this for the long term, and there is going to be any difficulty in maintaining consensus on the main issues for the long term.
Can we go on with 2 more questions? We've got two questions about the role of China in climate negotiation. So one from Pierre Noël. Are you here, Pierre?
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Pierre Noël from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. I've got a question for Scott Barrett. Of course, as we all know, with the geopolitics of US-China relations have moved quite a bit since the milestones that you reminded us about, Copenhagen and Paris, which were given, depending on how you look at them, either delivered by the G2 of the US and China or allowed, enabled by the G2. And now we are moving quite rapidly towards what looks like an emerging Cold War between the US and China. And I think it's too important to miss that. So I really wanted to ask you how your basic framework of looking at this is being impacted by the changing geopolitics of the US-China relations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Before you answer, I'll turn on the microphone to Cheng Gai Tsong. Sorry again for the pronunciation. Are you here?
Hi, can you hear me?
Very good. Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually a college student from China, and good morning, everyone. I have a question for Jonathan, and how do you see China's role and influence in global environmental governance, and will Biden team cooperate with Chinese government on environmental issues in the future? That's my question, and thank you very much.
Okay, if you want, you can answer now about China.
Well, maybe I'll start. I'll be, I think, brief about this. First, if I could just say, Brendan, I'm also a graduate of the LSE, and I didn't use the words game theory and was trying not to be technical in any respect. And so I was really pleased that you noticed that connection. I agree with you, obviously, about the power of that approach and use it in lots of situations involving international negotiations and cooperation. I should say one of my early applications of game theory was at the invitation of the European Commission in I think around 1991, when Europe was in thinking in advance of the Rio negotiations that were upcoming. Europe was looking to develop a carbon tax. And I was asked by the Commission if I could suggest how they could negotiate a tax among the, I think, 12 states, member states at that time. So that was quite exciting. I think it remains true today that there is power on that in that approach. Obviously, like any approach, you want to be aware of its limitations as well. On China, I would say, first of all, I'm not a China expert at all. I have a colleague, Tom Christensen, in my school at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. And Tom sent me an article he just wrote, was published in Foreign Affairs, in which he argues that the Cold War, Pierre, is not the right way to think about the complex and difficult relations between China and the United States. So I would urge you to read that piece from a real expert. What I would say is that although these two countries are rivals in many respects, they also have joint interests, and where historically they've been able to identify those interests, they have made progress. One of the areas that I was interested in years ago was dealing with piracy off the Horn of Africa. So this is thinking a little bit along the lines of, Brendan mentioning the Kimberley process and blood diamonds. I think you need to look at the larger landscape when you look at international relations and not just in individual areas. So I think there is a history of the US and China being able to cooperate where their interests align. And I think that, of course, one of the requirements of diplomacy is to identify those points. And China will be worried about climate change as well. So I think that's it's critical that those countries be able to agree. It's more than that, by the way, because I also think, again, I think this focus on individual country targets has been unhelpful from the very beginning. China's own emissions, which are important, but also China's activities to promote fossil fuels outside its own borders, that's also important. So we need to bring about a global transformation in technology and investment. And so we need to start from the point of view of strategy, and then to develop relations and approaches that can bring that about. So I don't see that as being an obstacle. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not the expert on China, but I do think it's absolutely critical. We're not going to make success worldwide unless you can get those two countries. You need more, but you definitely need those two. And we'll see what comes from this meeting that Jonathan told us about, that Biden is convening April 22 and April 23, to see whether the countries are able to establish an ability. Maybe they won't have a strategy yet fully worked out, but an ability, a desire to move in lockstep. Thank you.
And from my side, Benedict, I would just add a couple of thoughts in response to the second question. I largely agree with what Scott just said. There is no solution to the climate change problem unless both the United States and China, as well as others, are engaged proactively in implementing solutions. China has a very capable team that looks at these issues. The return to the role of climate envoy of Xi Jinping is a very positive development, I would say. That doesn't mean that all of the other political issues go away. They don't. They need to be worked through in a professional way. And that is a process that has started and that will require time to move ahead. But I think it is utterly important to remember that China's engagement on climate is not something that China would or should do because it is being nice to the United States or to anybody else. China needs climate solutions as well. Look at the implications under sea level rise scenarios for Shanghai, Guangzhou, all of the major coastal cities of China. China needs climate solutions. And what should China's role be here? One would hope that the long stated objective of a greening of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a point that has been circulating now for several years, that is translated from being rhetorical flourish into reality. There's abundant scope for that to happen. It has not happened yet to a meaningful degree. That would be a very, very positive development if China, for example, ceased to be selling new coal-fired power plants around the globe. That would be a big, big positive step.
Okay. I'll give the microphone to Ulrike Steigerman, who has a question about the importance of the coal industry in some US regions and how Joe Biden will deal with that. Ulrike, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello. Great, thank you for your talk, which were very inspiring. I'm a researcher at the University of Magdeburg, and my question is, given the political polarization of the country and also the economic importance of the coal industry in some regions in the US, how can Biden ensure acceptance of or gain support for his climate policy? Maybe this is a question to Jonathan.
Well, I'm happy to start, but others I hope will also jump in. Look, the coal industry is historically a very important industry in a couple of different states. And you rightly point to the skepticism that many voters in those states, and here I'm referring to West Virginia, parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wyoming, great skepticism toward Joe Biden and his proposed program. As a general matter, I think that any prospects for a virtuous cycle of climate activism by the new administration that could be then sustained over time will swing very heavily on people seeing new opportunities, job creation first and foremost, that arise from a transition to clean energy technologies. This is why, if you look at the remarks that have been made by the new Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, you will see her emphasizing time and again job creation, economic redevelopment, and other related ideas. The same from Gina McCarthy, the National Climate Advisor. So I do not think that I don't think that the coal industry in the United States is coming back. That's quite clear. So the opportunity set, the making the transition to clean energy and seeing benefits that provide alternative sources of employment, that's going to be critical. And most potently, that will be looked to as an example of what may be the future if over time we start to see more and more and more from one year to the next progress to reduce oil and gas consumption, or at least in the case of oil consumption to see that go down. So those parts of the country are more plentiful. The current workforce orders of magnitude larger than the coal workforce, so the stakes are consequently higher.
Maybe if I can just jump in just one sec. I'm not the expert on this area, but Ulrika, one thing to say is under Trump, coal consumption continued to fall in the United States. So what you're getting from Trump is rhetoric. And the positive side to it, and the negative side to it is kind of obvious to us. But the positive was, in a sense, giving dignity to people who feel that they've been ignored. And I think that that's a lesson probably the Biden administration. Remember that one of those four pillars that Jonathan said the Biden administration is going to care about is about economic, I'll call it reconstruction, really. And it's, he uses that term, Biden uses that term, build back better, which I know is popular worldwide. But I think he's got to combine these things so that these politically prominent groups, maybe economically not very powerful, but politically very powerful, we're able to get the votes that are needed, very similar to what Merkel had to do in Germany to get a phase out. It could be very costly, as it has been in Germany. But I think that we have to learn the lessons of that Waxman-Markey bill I mentioned that passed the House, never came up for a vote in the Senate. How do you actually get the votes? And you can't just focus on ambition and targets. You need to get very concrete, both about what you're going to do, why it will be transformative, and why you can get Congress to support it. Thank you.
And I want to point to something that Brendan highlighted, which I think is terribly relevant here, and that is for parts of the workforce that see a diminution in the demand for coal, oil and gas, et cetera, a very important short-term measure can be to employ those people to secure and restore, mine tailings, mine mouths, to stop methane leakage out of those mines. There's some very important work on this that was done by my colleague, Jason Bordoff, together with Daniel Ramey and Neelish Nerukar, looking at the potential opportunity set for capping disused oil and gas wells around the United States. And that's a lot of the same workforce that otherwise may feel like they've got a target on their back.
Still many questions arriving. So Bernard, I think you would like to ask questions, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm a philosopher in the CNRS Political Research Center of SciencesPo. One question for Jonathan. Goals and ambition are one thing, but measures another one. Here in France today, we start the debate around the law project climate and resilience in the parliament. The ways national strategies regarding social justice are very conflicting, and see, for instance, the yellow vest, the so-called yellow vest crisis we had in the year 2018. And I was in New York with you, Scott, you remember perhaps. So what measure will be chosen in the US? Will they be accepted? And recently, John Kerry visited the actual ecological transition minister, considering many points of these laws. And he said that some would have been impossible in the US. For example, the ban to take an airplane under 2.5 hours for a journey. And another question for Scott, and I will stop. Scott, since you are very familiar with game theory, it has been repeated today, does it make a difference or a big difference between Trump and Biden in terms of international negotiation? What does it make in terms of their respective responsibilities, since in the game theory, the entity you consider is a state and not a president?
Thank you, Bernard. Just to start the response, I mean, I think you are highlighting what is absolutely the critical point, which is you have to translate lofty goals into specific measures or a suite of different measures. And I would summarize the response to you by saying that there will be more carrots imposed rather than sticks. Instead, there are bills that have been proposed in the US Congress, for example, that would mandate a clean energy standard for the United States by 2030. This could be a very, very effective measure if it were enacted. Unfortunately, I don't see a great deal of encouragement right now, although I would be delighted to be found inaccurate in that judgment. Instead, what I think you're going to see are measures that are embedded into the infrastructure bill that is to be proposed this week to do things, and I listed a number of the different areas that could be focused on earlier in my remarks, but building things translates into public procurements, which translates into employment, and that is where the rubber meets the road. So rather more carrots than sticks, opportunities to do useful things through an infrastructure bill. That's the core of my answer.
Bernard, what a great question. Is there a difference between Trump and Biden? Well, yes, very big difference. You're right that game theory, game theory involves abstraction, and but there are different branches of game theory. So there's analytical game theory, which involves abstraction. I also do experiments with people. Now, people come with their own personalities, psychology, beliefs, and so on. And they sometimes will behave very much in a way that's consistent with the analytical theories. and sometimes they don't, and there's always variation. You know, the human population is a diverse population, and Trump and Biden are two very different people. And in terms of mindset, for example, Trump is clearly not oriented at all towards positive sum thinking, which is the essence of all climate negotiations and almost all negotiations outside of real estate. So his orientation is really quite different. I would say that I don't think this is a difficulty for the academy. I have colleagues in international relations in my school, SIPA. One very distinguished professor, Robert Jervis, has really been a pathbreaker in this field of psychology, and how the psychology of leaders is really important in developing their strategies and their country's behavior. And we have a newer member of the faculty, Karen Yarimilo, and she, student of Bob's, and she has used his own techniques so that she's able to look at how just foreign policy decisions in the security realm have been affected by the psychology of the leaders, where to understand the psychology, she does really fascinating research to basically create a kind of a type for different leaders. So the people that we elect, you know, our system of government in the United States is meant to be about rules and institutions and less about individuals, but individuals have power. We've seen that over and over and over again. And we see it with Trump, and we see it with Biden, and we see it in all of history. So I think what we need intellectually is a way to bring these together. And I would also link it, Bernard, with the legislature, because you also need to get votes passed for legislation. So what we need is, you know, kind of, I'll use the term game theory, but I'm not so much wedded to a particular technique as a kind of an intellectual attitude almost, where we need to combine what's essential about the international institutions, and I'll use the word treaty, I think it is the most important. You couple that though with the requirement of ratification, which means you need approval by Parliament, Senate in the United States, or if you're going to circumvent that, as we did with Paris through executive order. I mean, Paris was constructed to allow the United States to join without passing it, without ratifying a treaty. So we, and within in that domestic situation, this relates to that question about the coal industry, among other things. How do you get support? How do you get those votes? So we need it at the executive level. They do the negotiations in the first place. We need it through the treaty arrangements, because that's what's binding countries. And then we need it at the legislative area. Jonathan, and we spoke earlier, used this term durable. I mean, that's one thing we need worldwide, is we need a durable approach. Kyoto is not durable for a lot of reasons by its construction. We need to have a durable approach that will be truly transformative in terms of investment and changing expectations worldwide for what the future is going to be. Where are you going to earn money? What's going to happen with the climate? What technologies are going to find markets, and so on and so forth. So it's the larger ambition, and I think that the personalities definitely matter, and we have to hope we get the right personality at the right time. I think Biden is showing a kind of mettle I never expected from him. Actually, I think he's rising to the time, and it feels to me like Grandpa's taken over the country. It's been a bit filled with mischief and misbehavior for a while. And so I think the prospects from that perspective are good. I just hope we learn the lessons, that it's not just the desire to bring about change that's needed. It's actually knowing how to do it through, and you know, he does come from this, from the Senate. How do you get it done there? How do you get it done diplomatically, and of course he was always engaged in diplomacy from his position in the Senate as well as vice president. So I think he has a lot of the capability. John Kerry does to some extent, but I also think I pointed out that both of them voted against that, voted in favor rather of that resolution, which was critical to the United States adopting the Kyoto Protocol. So I hope they've learned the lessons along the way about how we can do much better. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. We have PhD students in economics who has many questions. Olesya Kechova. Olesya, I will ask you to focus on 1 or 2 questions, please, because we have many other questions.
Thank you. Dear moderators, dear colleagues, the participants of a joint event by SciencesPo and Columbia University in the city of New York and the Lions Zone after the Joe Biden election, which reset for climate policy. Dear guests and invitees, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event. My name is Olesya Viacheslavoovna Kochetkova. I have a scientific degree of the Candidate of Sciences in Economics, 2008, from the St. Petersburg State University of Economics and Finance, Russian Federation, by the specialty Economy and National Economic Management, and the leading organization is the Institute of Challenges for Regional Economy of the Russian Academy of Sciences. I thank the spokespersons for the presentations, and I want to ask my core questions. The questions for all speakers, please. Purport of my first question is, how do you think can fulfillment of the assigned goal and strategic objectives, such as expanding the capabilities of the domestic manufacturing supply chain, increase the role of small and medium-sized manufacturers in advanced manufacturing, fostering the ecosystems of manufacturing innovation, and reinforcement of the defense manufacturing base, provide the implementation of the Biden plan to build a modern, sustainable infrastructure and an equitable clean energy future within the confines of innovation in the field for driving dramatic cost reductions in critical clean energy technologies, including battery storage, negative emissions technologies, the next generation of building materials, renewable hydrogen, and advanced nuclear, and rapidly commercialize them, ensuring that those new technologies are made in America. Thank you for attention. Yes.
Okay.
And
we have to stop you because we have 10 minutes left and many other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Scott, Jonathan, Brandon, do one of you want to make a comment or an answer to this comment or question? I'm not sure.
So briefly, let me just say that this issue of innovation in clean energy technologies is terribly, terribly important, and it has implications for not just small and medium enterprise, but enterprises at all scale. I mean, one of the most important collaborations that we created in advance of the Paris climate negotiations was a structure referred to as Mission Innovation. It highlighted the importance of, in particular, cost reduction for a number of technologies that are needed for the so-called hard to abate sectors. So that's going to be a core element of what the Biden administration focuses on. That's already been signaled. And frankly, those cost reductions are going to be critical for that ever difficult last 20% of the emissions reductions that we need to get to a decarbonized future.
Okay, Adrien, can you hear me? You have a question for, can't remember, maybe Jonathan? Maybe Jonathan?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting and very stimulating discussion. I would like to ask you a question about the mandate of Mr. Kerry. And more specifically, we know he's a special envoy on climate change, but he's also a principal on the principal seat on the National Security Council. So I would like to know, what does that mean for the, let's say, the American approach of the security implications of climate change? We know that's something that has been discussed widely by the intelligence and the defense communities in the US. And what does that mean for the future and for the let's say, the importance of climate security within the Biden administration? That's a question for maybe either Professor Barrett or Professor Elkind. Thank you.
Scott, should I start or do you want to start?
Yeah, Jonathan, you start.
So as a matter of practicalities, the shortest answer to your question, Adrien, is that it means that Kerry will be at the table to inject climate-related questions into all of the meetings at the level of principals in the US National Security Council. The NSC in the US is a very structurized decision-making procedure. And so the significance of that fact is not to be underestimated. I certainly wouldn't say that climate issues would be absent if Mr. Kerry were not present at those meetings, because, as I said, the message that has come very clearly since January 20th and the inauguration of President Biden is that climate is on everybody's to-do list. Nonetheless, this guarantees the presence of those issues in a very important and powerful way.
Let me just say briefly, again, Biden has these 4 different, I guess I'll call them pillars. I'm not sure what they're called, but these 4 different mega challenges. One of them being climate, one of them being the economy. And I think he's going to need to link them. And one way in which that can show up is in something called industrial policy. And this is going to link with trade. And it's relevant from the point of view of the National Security Council because of its strategic orientation. And I hope that the right lessons of the last 30 years of efforts have been learned by Mr. Kerry and the president, because we've been trying the same approach basically for 30 years. We started off in 1988 with unofficial meeting in Toronto, where countries agreed. This is, again, unofficial, a little bit more like the Kimberley process, a little bit more in that direction that Brendan had mentioned before. Countries from that started to announce unilateral targets and timetables. And we're still doing that 30 years later. And meanwhile, the total amount of the cumulative emissions from 1750 to 1990, when these negotiations started, is actually less than emissions just in the last 30 years. So I don't think you can look at that and say there's been much success. But where we've had success in diplomacy in areas that are relevant for climate, there's been a strategic orientation that has changed innovation and diffusions. This relates to Alicia's question. And I think that's the lesson we have to learn. The Montreal Protocol not only directly limited emissions of the CFCs and so on, but also in this really great work by Eugénie de Goa, who a French assistant professor at the London School of Economics, shows that treaty stimulated innovation. I don't think we've had some innovation, but you can't really say how much of it's due to the climate treaties. And there are other treaties like them where there's been a transformation, but the orientation has been strategic. Protection of the oceans, driven through treaties on tanker designs, for example, has stimulated new kinds of tankers adopted worldwide. So it's coupling the orientation on technology, kind of forcing innovation And having implicit in this a trade measure about what tankers would be allowed into your own ports, has brought this entire flip so that the whole infrastructure of shipping has totally changed. That's what we need to do worldwide. So I think that's where the link is on the technology, innovation, and strategic dimensions. I think that's how they all connect.
We have 3 minutes left. I may ask to Julien and Anis. You have both questions to Brendan. Could you ask your questions, please? So Julien, can you start? Julien, I hear.
Here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Apologies. So John Perez from OGCI. Hello to all of you. Thanks for the great talk. Very quickly, I was just wondering how you think the policy should encompass the issue of approaching things by value chain. I'm raising the point because it happens that what we see, I'm working for a coalition of players, that it serves quite a lot in terms of a catalyst of change. And we see more and more movement to act as value chain. And I was just wondering if you see a way for policy to enable action through value chain instead of sector by sector. And particularly, it would potentially help in solving the issue of importing greenhouse gas emission like the one Europe or the US could experience by importing a lot of good produced elsewhere. Thank you.
And Anis Azouni, you have also questions to Brendan, for Brendan.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. The new oil and gas producers are pressing for a greater role for oil in their economy, and I find their situation alarming. Some of these countries are starting to exhibit some of the highest energy intensity in the world. They are in no position at the same time to move to energy, NOC type company format, low carbon, etc. And particularly since they can simply not, they are not in position to afford it financially, as well as in terms, and more importantly, the quality of their institutional framework. I am definitely confident that both Europe and the US have the best intention to assist such countries, but what can they do in a meaningful and basically in a way that can short circuit some of the investment decisions which are being made in the Caribbean, West Africa, and so forth? Thank you.
Great questions. Any country that has jelly beans has to eat them. That's the old view. We need to change that perspective. It's no longer any possibility to say that all these hydrocarbons around the world need to be developed and to be used. One of the big changes that needs to come is we need a new definition of resources, and one that respects the 1.5 degree pathway that we have as a common pathway for the global community. It's absolutely the case that we cannot develop all hydrocarbons everywhere in the world and stick with the Paris Agreement commitments. And so something has to give somewhere. Around the world, we need to gouge out some of the difficult resource issues from national accounts. We can't see Botswana, for example, going ahead with its coal reserves plan under Chinese tutelage and see that that is compatible with a 2050 agreement. It's impossible to see that. So what's the alternative for Botswana? Well, Botswana has the opportunity of looking at disaggregated energy systems, which are more in keeping with its population profile. It has a lot of land, it has sunlight, it has a great many other attributes that we could build on and create an alternative future for them. and not a great deal of imagination has been put into that. The equivalent of the Belt and Road from the European Union and potentially from the United States, Canada, and others should be to provide an alternative, a sensible alternative, which takes modern technologies and recognizes that on a life cycle analysis, the costs of providing electricity through new systems is either equivalent or lower than using hydrocarbons for these countries. And if you are suggesting that, for example, countries in East Africa need to develop gas resources that need to be used in dense urban areas, there are already existing technologies that can be used for that type of work, whether it's heat pumps, reverse heat pumps, any number of things that can be put in place today. So I don't think that we have a technology problem in producing alternatives. I do think we have an imagination problem in providing answers. And that is the question that the European Union and the United States and Canada and others need to step up to. It's the imagination, it's the ability to project a change onto the reality that we see in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia. That is what we need, and that is coming, I think, certainly from the European Union. We are actively thinking, how can we prepare a package of work that is as attractive or more attractive to the countries which are developing hydrocarbons. For those who have developed hydrocarbons, we need to find exits. We need to kick out the stool on which they're sitting on and think of some other way of developing their economies. And the links to the European Union and to the developed economies may be the route to that. The trade issue is very, very important. And we need to make sure that we exploit that trade relationship to drive change in those countries. It is no longer possible for the European Union to displace its carbon emissions to third countries and claim leadership on global emissions reductions. That is not going to continue indefinitely. We need, especially if we have a carbon border adjustment tax, because we will not be able to simply send all of our goods production and manufacturing abroad and reap the benefits in energy intensity ratios in the European Union. That's not going to be a sustainable future for us, and it's not a sustainable future for the globe. So I think we have to lastly, slay some of these dragons. We need to think about how we can actually change these things, and that is where the ideas that potentially we could pick up from communities of thought like the Center on Global Energy Policy, SciencesPo. These are the types of discussions that you should be leading on as the community of thinkers and providing answers to us, the policymakers, to implement. And I contrast my professional experience in Brussels with my professional experience in Washington. In Washington, I was bombarded with daily discussion pieces from think tanks, from communities, from universities. In the European Union, in the energy policy, in the environmental policy, and climate policy, we have not developed that reflex of drawing on universities to provide new ideas and to provide thought leadership. And potentially, I'll take this as the last point I'll make today, it's places like SciencesPo which hold the answers to our future challenges. And I hope that communities such as yours will pick up the challenge and give me 10 good ideas by Christmas. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brandon, for this birth and for this invitation. We take very, very seriously. I hope we will be able to honor at least some of it, but I'm not sure SciencesPo has some solution, but at least we have some space for dialogue. And we would be very happy to prolong and to have regular meetings like this one to discuss this kind of transatlantic setting, at least. starting from there, what this kind of what this new agenda for climate policy is. So thank you very much to the three of you. It was a fascinating symposium, and we had many questions. We will forward you the questions we had just for your information, and we couldn't take all of them, but we will have other occasions to meet and discuss together. I think this is a very fascinating period we are living because, of course, there's a very early mandate in the US administration, and we're still in the beginning of a new administration in the EU with the commission, which is starting to implement the policy it has designed. So it's a very fascinating period of time, I believe. And I also just want one sentence to conclude, to draw the attention of those of us who are, I would say, very focused on climate and the environment. Of course, the task is tremendous, but at the same time, if we look at the climate policy, among other multilateral issues, climate is doing not so bad. Multilateral relations are in very, very tense and difficult situations in many areas, and climate can be an area, one of the areas where a more multilateral world can be designed and so this is, I see that as a relatively good news as a citizen and very inspiring issue as a political scientist, social scientist. So thank you to our audience. Thank you most of all to very brilliant and exciting panelists. It was a very vivid and interesting discussion. So I'm sure we'll have other occasions. So thank you. Have a good evening or whatever, a good day if you start from another time zone. Thank you to Benedict and all of you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone.